Marriage is more than constant bliss or unending sacrifice.
It's exploring your own story and seeing the other for who they are, even as they change.
It's the discovery of life in the gaps and the mysteries that emerge when we believe that fullness is possible for each other.
Marriage is choosing the other's flourishing on a daily basis to build a relationship that thrives and reflects the kingdom of God.
Choosing Us, a 4-week series on marriage that will introduce you to each of our campus pastors and their spouses,
will remind us all that we cannot do God's work in the world without being bound to one another.
We must choose one another
Again and again.
we must choose God.
Again and again.
We must learn who we are
And who the other is in our midst.
So here we are in the Dickens pub at the English Inn.
One of our favorite places in Lansing.
Yes, it's like this little 15-person pub. Pub prices on the Grand River. We've had a lot of conversations in this place.
A lot of good burgers, a lot of good food
Yes.
and drinks.
We've come here to celebrate. We've come here to cry, and we've had, it's been a really special place for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm excited to have this conversation with you about spiritual intimacy in the Dickens pub.
Love it. It's great. It's perfect.
So we met on January 18th of 1995 at the Boys and Girls Club on the south side of Chicago in the Dearborn Projects.
As volunteers for a student ministry through Wheaton College.
Exactly. So while we were at the projects, we both kind of met in this place where racial and economic justice was a really important thing to both of us before we even met. It's been a theme of our marriage ever since.
Yeah. Yep. And then by this point, I soon graduated and then was working as the youth director up at a big church in northern Michigan. And eventually we got married up there on May 31st, 1997. While we were still children. Got an apartment, started our life up there. And you joined the church to work there too?
I moved into your apartment with your culture in small town northern Michigan.
My family
your
nearby.
Family culture. Yep. Like I was like a fish out of water. I had kind of a losing myself experience, not sure who I was about a year or two into it.
So eventually you came on staff at the same church I was working at, which was Petoskey United Methodist Church. And it was manifestly clear to both of us that there are 2 leaders in this relationship and 0 followers. But I was the director of youth ministry and you were the kind of broader director of ministries. In 2000, we bought a house and began practicing Christian hospitality. So we invited an older gentleman from the homeless shelter where you were volunteering to actually come and live with us. And and so adventures in all of that began.
We've been doing that in some form or fashion ever since. And then in 2003, I had pulled back from full-time ministry at that point to start freelancing, and I published my very first book, Walking with Frodo. In 2005, we moved to Durham, North Carolina, where I went to seminary until 2008. In 2007, you decided to get an MTS at Duke Divinity School as well.
My Master's of Theological Studies.
Duke Divinity Blue Devils.
Yes, go Blue Devils.
And in 2009, I was appointed as the pastor of Sycamore Creek.
So we moved then from Durham, North Carolina to the suburbs of Lansing to Holt, Michigan. And that's where Adventures in Ministry at Sycamore Creek began. It was pretty clear to us pretty soon that this was a time to maybe start a family. We had never really felt driven or called to do that before. And in 2010, we had Micah John, our eldest. And then just a few years later, we had Sam, our youngest.
Fast forward several years, and in 2022, Sycamore Creek, after having multiple campuses, decided to adopt another church and launch a new campus across from Eastwood Town Center, which became our Eastwood campus. And you and I moved with our kids from Holt into Lansing proper in Groesbeck neighborhood.
13 years in Holt, and now we are residents of Lansing, and our kids go to Lansing Public Schools.
throughout these many, many years we've been married, I think we're coming up on 28. We have consistently chosen spiritual intimacy, consistently chosen to do practices and things that build spiritual intimacy in our relationship, our marriage.
Yeah. And spiritual intimacy feels kind of like a big term. Like, what does that actually mean? And so that's what our message is about.
So what is spiritual intimacy? And our oldest son, Micah, maybe hits it on the head at some level. On our 23rd anniversary, I asked him, why do you think mom and dad have been married for 23 years? And he said, his first answer was, we grow close to God together. He also said, we greet each other when we come in the room or in the morning. He said, we talk about it when we're frustrated, and we're kind to each other. I mean, that could just be a 4-point sermon outline right there.
Sure.
Right out of the
good
mouth
definition
of
spiritual intimacy.
But what
Absolutely.
we really want to dive into is this idea that we grow closer to God together.
Yeah. So I kind of picture it like God is the top of a mountain, and our individual goal is to draw closer to God. And the closer you go up the mountain towards God, and the closer I get towards the top of the mountain, we're actually getting closer to each other, even if we're on our own unique path.
Mm-hmm.
And so in your pursuit of a deep relationship with God and my pursuit, it in fact draws us closer to each other, not just to God.
Yeah. I asked AI to make this image, but before it made this image, it made a different image of which God is like a deformed old white guy in the sky at the top of the triangle. The woman is gracefully running up the side of the triangle with her robes flowing, while the man is naked inside of the triangle climbing the mountains.
Atlas holding it all up or something.
That's what our future
Thank
overlords
you.
think of
The future overlords.
Intimacy.
Women are just naturally on this like effortless journey towards God, and men are clawing their way through the bowels of the earth.
So what is spiritual intimacy in marriage? Here's a quick definition. Spiritual intimacy develops when there is a shared commitment to discipleship and mission, or you could say calling, in your marriage.
So I feel like the word discipleship is very churchy, and it's worth unpacking that a little bit. And, as I'm leading Kids Creek downstairs and we're doing stories about Jesus, specifically about Jesus this year from the New Testament, we talk about the disciples, and these are the people that follow Jesus. And it wasn't just the 12 dudes. There were crowds of people that followed Jesus. And they wanted to get close to him because not only for his wisdom, but there was something about his personality and demeanor that they wanted to be like. And so they wanted to, a disciple is somebody who not only wants to learn from, but also wants to become like the person that they're following. And so marriage as discipleship is the opportunity for both people in a partnership to be growing more and more like Jesus, both individually and together. And that spiritual formation, that marriage is sort of a crucible or a garden for that kind of growth.
So at its best, marriage is learning to love your spouse with the same unconditional love that God loves us. And you are learning something about God's love. You're learning something about, unconditional love. You're a disciple of love in this commitment of marriage. So choosing spiritual intimacy is not just discipleship, it's also mission and calling. What is God's mission through your spouse to the world? And what is God's mission through your marriage to the world?
Mm-hmm. And what role do each of you play in that mission coming to fulfillment?
Mm-hmm.
And then as you think about both of you in a relationship, what is your level of commitment individually to working towards that mission?
Yeah. So spiritual intimacy is nurtured when the two together are committed to that mission and vision, both again through the spouse, but also through the marriage to the world. That creates this really strong bond of spiritual intimacy.
Yeah. Yep. And in some ways, you're pastoring, you're kind of a shepherd for your spouse. Like you're co-pastoring in this together.
All right, so we like to stop in the middle of messages, give people a chance to chat. So we invite you to turn to your neighbor or put in the comments your answer to this question. If your life had a mission statement, what would it be? And if you're married, what would your marriage's mission statement be? Let's talk about it. Today we're continuing in a series based on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous teaching. And this particular series is called Choosing Us, based on a book of the same title by Gail Song Bantam and Brian Bantam, who you and I were actually in school with at Duke. So it was kind of fun to see what they're up to and how they're writing these days. And Jesus ranges all over the place in his topics in the Sermon on the Mount. And so I'm going to read a scripture that speaks really specifically from the Sermon on the Mount to marriage and marriage relationships. In Matthew 5:31-32, Jesus says, "You have heard the law that says a man can divorce his wife by merely giving her a written notice of divorce. But I say that a man who divorces his wife, unless she has been unfaithful, causes her to commit adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman also commits adultery." Whew. Like, whoa. Okay. So this challenges us in a lot of ways, our culture today. This has been used to abuse and oppress women in a lot of ways. To like say, hey, go back to your abusive husband or partner. Yep. But I think what Jesus is really, like what his heart is in this message, is that women didn't have a lot of rights. Their provision, their protection in that culture all came through their spouse, through their husband. And you couldn't just throw your wife off because you didn't like her anymore, because she wasn't a good cook. Just saying, hey, listen, you have to care for her, love her. Because she's not a good cook. That makes me laugh. And, or because she talks back to you, I mean. That never happens in our marriage. Never. And of course, in today's culture, women have a bit more options for protection, thankfully, than just marriage. And yet there's still a lot of vulnerability in society for single women. And you see Jesus getting at the depth and importance of that marriage commitment. You don't take this lightly. It's not like a fad or a certain hobby that you have for a little bit and then you switch up to a different hobby. Yeah. It's a spiritual discipline. Right. Of discipleship. Right. Sometimes when you get into the Bible and marriage, like people like to throw out all kinds of stuff like gay marriage isn't biblical. And next time somebody does that, you can just say, hey, are you divorced? Because that's not biblical. And if you're divorced for any reason other than infidelity, that's not biblical. And even if you are divorced because of infidelity and you're remarried, you're still committing adultery. So that's not biblical either. Two can play at this literal game. Absolutely. Yeah. Now, I don't believe any of that, but there's some bigger things we have to take into account when we look at a passage like this. So back to talking about this commitment that we don't take lightly. So Jesus is talking about various commandments here, including one of the 10 with adultery. But there's also this vision of marriage as a covenant, which is a mutual agreement. And the way that Gail and Brian talk about it in their book is that I choose not to be who I am without you. And also, I choose to be who I am with you. Who am I spiritually? Who are you spiritually? And who are we spiritually together? Now, to prepare for this message, we did a survey. And it's a very unscientific survey. 20 people took the survey. It's not a representative sample of people as a whole. But the results of it found that if you think spiritual intimacy is important in your relationship, then it's likely that you are with someone who also thinks spiritual intimacy is important. But the view of spiritual intimacy, what exactly that is very narrow. It's like prayer and Bible reading and going to church together. Like, that's about it. That's about it. So much more can be said or reflected on when it comes to spiritual intimacy and choosing it in your marriage?
So one of the ways that couples build intimacy in general or get to know each other is through something super popular, the 5 love languages.
Yeah.
And it's been popularized by Gary Chapman and various iterations, and typically considered 5 love languages. The first of the love languages is words of affirmation. The second is quality time, then acts of service, physical touch, and giving and receiving gifts. And the two of us are actually, we track pretty similarly on this.
Really close.
Really close. So my top 2, when you do those little assessments online, are touch and quality time.
And mine are the exact same, but just flip-flopped. Quality time is first, and then touch. Some other researchers that have influenced us are John and Julie Gottman, and they add a kind of corrective to this whole idea of 5 love languages. And they say basically there's probably as many languages as there are individuals.
Absolutely. That would make sense. So if we take this idea of love languages and apply it towards building spiritual intimacy in marriage and understanding each other and growing in intimacy together, we can kind of put those languages into a category of spiritual intimacy. And so we can think of 5 spiritual intimacy languages also as being words and time and serving and touch and giving.
So what we want to do then is begin to unpack a much bigger view of spiritual intimacy, one of these at a time. So let's think first about words. How do we choose words to build spiritual intimacy?
So we have a couple different ideas up on the screen, but we're going to focus on just one of those. And the top one we're going to talk about is a family mission statement. Down the road, we can maybe someday talk about family values list and daily prayer, but that mission statement is going to be our focus.
So we're putting a QR code up on the screen right now so people can look at a resource that we've compiled that's different things that have been helpful for you and me as we think through these sorts of things. So many, many years ago, we sat down and thought through what's our family mission statement, and we came up with a pretty simple one, that our family exists to be a means of God's grace in the lives of those around us, that God's grace would flow through us in our interactions with other people.
So that's the spiritual intimacy language of words.
Yeah.
So the second one is time and how we use and spend our time together.
There's lots of ways you can use time to choose spiritual intimacy. Worship together, be in a small group together, practice Sabbath together, go on retreats together. But the one that we're going to dig into right now is creating spaces of wonder and awe, cultivating wonder and awe. Again, we have a QR code that you can go and look at resources from all those other ones. But let's dig down into wonder and awe.
Yeah, and this one's fun because, like you said, most people have a kind of narrow view of spiritual intimacy where like going to worship together, spending time in worship together is one of those. But wonder and awe for us as a family has involved getting out in creation and engaging with art. Those are 2 areas where we do that. And this, we're going to just show a really fun video of something that took place during COVID, where 2 of the getting out in creation and experiencing art kind of collided in a fun way.
Are we still looking for fairy houses?
Ooh, I like that.
Looks like we're still looking for fairy houses. Hi, Ron.
Sure.
We're out in Birchfield Park right now, and it's become family tradition to come here on the nights that you're free.
And that it's nice.
When it's nice, which has not been very often, but it's still more often than before the pandemic because there's no place else to go. So I don't know, a month ago, 3 weeks ago, when we were out here, we discovered that somebody has been painting little fairy houses or little fairy doors and gates and signs and things and leaving them for us to find, almost like an Easter egg hunt. And every time we come, there's something new. There's like whole fairy villages And I've always been one who, fairies are one of my favorite pretends. So it has been a glimpse of, it has given us joy and shown us the just immense creativity of people and their just generosity to share that freely. Total strangers. And we may never know who it is that's making them. So that's a glimpse.
So where has God been at in that?
Well, God created us to make things, and I think that creating things is an act of worship to our Maker, and to share that freely with others is also a glimpse of the generosity of God and His grace, His abundance in creating this incredible park and place that we are right now, and each other. That's His artwork, and He gives it to us to enjoy.
Oh my God. That's heavenly. Woo!
That was such a fun surprise to be walking through Birchfield and just week after week, more of these little fairy houses popping up.
It was delightful.
It was so
delightful.
It was a real sort of spiritual moment for us out in nature with art.
Yes, discovery
Yeah.
and awe.
And I think that was a growing closer to God together, engaging that awe and wonder, and then growing closer together in it. So we're going to stop here and give you a chance to answer a question. What are some steps you could choose to nurture spiritual intimacy through the use of time with those around you, whether that's your spouse or your friends? Let's talk about it. All right, we've been reshaping Gary Chapman's ideas of the 5 love languages into 5 spiritual intimacy languages. The first one was words, second one was time, and now we want to talk about service. So we're going to take this idea of service and apply it to spiritual intimacy. Choose to serve God's call in your spouse to nurture spiritual intimacy. And again, here's a couple different ways that people can do that. They can do it through vocation, through parenting, through volunteering. But we're going to drill down on this idea of vocation. Vocation literally means calling, but your calling could be your job or it might be something else. Your calling sometimes is like, what's your passion? What are your dreams? What really breaks your heart in this world? And your job might be just how you pay the bills so that you can do your calling. But for some of us, our calling and our job, they overlap. And that's really beautiful when that happens.
One of the ways that you have encouraged me in my vocation as a writer is and a writer that feels called to talk about the things of God and of faith, is that not only do you pay the bills, so you're like my number one patron of the arts, thank you, but also, we carve out time in the schedule for me to go on writing retreats because that is one of the best ways that I get really solid chunks of time to focus on my work. And that doesn't happen in a family with kids without you as my spouse carving out that time and making sure I can get away to do that.
I'm serving God's call in your life when I hold down the house for you to be away to
Sure.
write.
Yeah. And there's a push and pull with that. I mean, there are times when your vocation as a pastor takes center stage, and other times when my role as a writer and my calling takes center stage. And so it's a give and take.
Now, my call to be a pastor is supported by you in all kinds of ways that you serve. I mean, there's some really practical ways. Right now, you are a coordinator for Kids Creek at Eastwood. Mm-hmm. But there's lots of intangible ways that, and some of it's just like, what's your expectations of me and when I'm available and when I'm not available, and being supportive through that and understanding the rhythms of a pastor's life.
We don't have weekends.
That was easier for you because you grew up as a pastor's kid, but
right.
It's still, it's a support of me and my calling. But I think also we both support our sense of call to justice work, racial, economic justice, gender, sexuality, inclusiveness, and so on. Like, those are ways that we support and hold each other up. And there's a spiritual intimacy that's created when we choose to serve each other in that way.
And to serve alongside each other in those calls. All right, so we're making our way through these 5 spiritual intimacy languages. We've talked about words and time and service. And the 4th one is touch.
Just like any good therapist says, like, touch is not just about sex. There's all kinds of non-sexual touch that's really important.
we often hear the phrase that we are spiritual beings having a bodily experience, but our understanding of the Christian creeds and Jesus' treatment of the body as something holy and worth loving and caring for is that we are actually embodied beings having an embodied experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of this physical stuff, it's not just physical stuff, it's spiritual stuff. So hugging, kissing, holding hands, snuggling, spooning, like all those are spiritual things. They're not separate from the spirit. They are spiritual. They're choosing spiritual intimacy. I remember in seminary when I learned that Jewish rabbis say that on the Sabbath, the day you're supposed to rest and stop working, that one of the acceptable activities or celebrate activities was to have sex on the Sabbath.
It's not work.
It's not work.
It's
Woohoo!
leisure and joy and fun.
Yeah. But I think we can go even deeper than that, that at its best, sex is standing before your spouse naked and unashamed. It's the unashamed part is the part of encountering God's unconditional love. Now, a lot of us don't have that kind of at its best experience of sex in marriage, but there is in sex, again, at its best, a sort of mutual giving and receiving, a mutual giving of one's body and receiving to one's body, which is sacramental-like. Like when we receive communion, there's a Jesus giving his body to us. And there is, I think, in sex, that same sort of, again, giving and receiving. It's sacramental-like. And unfortunately, men are not super great at this all of the time. Research shows that there's this big orgasm gap between men and women. And couples tend to be focused more on the man's pleasure and not the woman's pleasure. And I think there's something then that, like, there's something off spiritually in that when the man and the couple are not as focused on the woman's pleasure as the man's pleasure.
Okay, so now that everybody is going to forget everything else about this message, except for the fact that Pastor Tom talked about the orgasm gap, we're going to move on.
I'll accept that. This can be the orgasm gap sermon.
So we've talked about the 5 spiritual intimacy languages of words and time and service and touch. And now we're going to move on to giving.
Back to that original inventory of the 5 love languages. When you and I took it, my score for giving and receiving gifts was a big fat 0.
Mine might be like less than 0. Is that possible?
I don't remember that, but mine was definitely a 0. Like usually,
it was such a relief because we were so similar that it was like, oh, good.
When people give me gifts, stuff, I'm like, how do I get rid of this stuff?
Unless it's something we can eat.
Or if you want to give me the gift of quality time, I'll accept that gift.
Yes, or a hug.
But
I love a hug.
Giving is not just about, like, in this context, can be about, like, what is your financial situation of your family, and how does your family or your marriage create the possibility to be generous with the world around you, with people around you, again, to be a means of God's grace with your money.
Yeah, and talking about money is a super intimate conversation in couples, and they don't always do it well. But if we move into the talking about giving as part of a spiritual intimacy practice, we move into, like, this is a possibility, a way for us to continue to grow more and more like Jesus together. And of course, obviously, one of the ways that that's often discussed is through tithing. But we want to push that a little bit and talk a little bit more about other ways.
When you choose giving to nurture spiritual intimacy, I think some ways you do that are you can choose to give regularly and you can choose to give sacrificially. So Paul in his letter to the Corinthians says this:
give in proportion to what you have. Whatever you give is acceptable if you give it eagerly, and give according to what you have, not what you don't have.
Of course, I don't mean your giving should make life easy for others and hard for yourselves. I only mean that there should be some equality. Right now, you have plenty and can help those who are in need. Now, here when we see this word equality, it's going to come up again shortly. This is like a huge topic in our culture right now, is equity and reparations, and there's this huge wealth gap. that is predicted by race. And here Paul's listening to saying there should just be some sort of equality or equity amongst people and that are in your orbit and who you care for and who you love. And when we hear Sycamore Creek talk about we hit different because we're committed to working towards racial equity, this is some of our motivation for that. But Paul continues.
He goes on to say, later, they will have plenty and can share with you when you need it. In this way, things will be equal.
There's that word equal again. And what that means then is sometimes we have to give sacrificially. And I remember when my dad and stepmom died and I received an inheritance, it was roughly 1 year's worth of salary. And one of the things that was really on our mind was to begin to help prepare for our kids going to college. But it was also this intergenerational transfer of wealth, which, as you and I have studied in racial and economic justice communities, that this sort of intergenerational transfer of wealth doesn't happen as often in Black communities or Black families. So we decided to use that inheritance. We did several things. We spent some on some things that we really wanted. We got some new beds and new clothes, but then we split the rest of it in half and put half of it away for our boys' education. And we gave half of it to the Black Church Studies program at Duke Divinity School for Black seminarians or seminarians of color, so that they might come out of their seminary education with less debt, or maybe hopefully no debt, although that wouldn't just be from us. That'd have to be other people that were helping them. And it was a real joy. It was really spiritually intimate to talk with you about that and to have your full support and to celebrate that. And it was a decision that we made together, and it chose spiritual intimacy through it.
So now it's not just our sons who get to go to college at a, in a way that makes it affordable, but now other people's sons and daughters do too, in families that maybe wouldn't have had a history of transfer of wealth.
Yeah, for there to be the equality that Paul's talking about, or equity of financial resources, some of us, often those of us who are white, are going to have to give sacrificially to make that happen.
And then the beautiful thing, as Paul talks about, is that and then those families get the opportunity down the road to also give and have the experience of that joy and amazingness, instead of always being buried with the fear of scarcity and not being able to afford college or whatever their dream is and their calling.
So we're inviting you in this message today to choose words, time, service, touch, and gifts to nurture spiritual intimacy. But we have one more question for you to talk about.
Of the 5 spiritual intimacy languages, words, time, service, touch, and gifts, which one comes most naturally in your relationships, whether with friends or your spouse? And which one could build more intimacy if you were to put some intentional choices in that direction?
Let's talk about it.